My name is Dr. Shay Houlihan, and I'm a member of the Behavioral Economics team. I'm excited to moderate this session, what I think is the most exciting session of the conference, although I was told not to say that. This is the Great Behavioral Exchange Debate. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers. Welcome to each of you and to you, the audience. We're about to embark on a 70-odd-minute session between these two teams. The proposition they will be debating is, there are no more easy wins in applied behavioral insights. Just to mention the running order, the debate is broken into 5 parts. The teams, each speaker of the two teams will be offering 5-minute or 7-minute opening statements followed by rebuttals. Then you, the audience, will have at least 10 minutes to debate the debaters yourselves, to bring up any questions or points that you feel have not been adequately addressed. Subsequently, the two teams will offer final counter-rebuttals and closing statements, and then we'll wrap up. So why does this debate matter? Why does the claim we're arguing today matter? It matters at least in part because most of us, to one extent or another, are invested in evaluating and demonstrating the value proposition of BI units and their work. Implicitly, the claim being debated today gets at 2 competing agendas. One is for BI units to continue the good work we already do in delivering a return on investments from relatively simple and expensive interventions, which, by the way, include replications of trials from other BI units. Another is for BI units to pursue more intensive, more expensive, and possibly more intrusive interventions, which, nonetheless, may return a higher return on investment. Now, I'm fairly confident all of us would like to think we can do both. There is no intrinsic reason why we should see these as competing priorities. But that may not be the reality that we live in. So when push comes to shove, how do we prioritize? All right, let's take a step back. One way to measure the quality of a debate is to see just how many people change their minds as a result of what is said. Because all of us are interested in data and evaluation, I'd like to invite all of us to take a vote on the proposition before and after the debate. So while I introduce the speakers, which I'm next going to do, why don't we take a gut check of the room? Let's take a baseline measure and vote on the proposition right now. So if you could please take out your phones, this is the one time that's allowed, and go to the URL tiny.cc/BX2018 pre-debate. Could we pull the slide up on the screens, please? There we go. tiny.cc/BX2018 pre-debate, and register your vote. Do you agree or disagree with the proposition? And while you're voting, let me introduce our debate teams in order of their speaking. First, for the two arguing in favor of the proposition, David Halpern is the Chief Executive and Board Director of the Behavioral Insights team. Prior to that, David was the founding director of the Institute for Government, and between 2001 and 2007, was the Chief Analyst of the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. Julia Fetherston co-founded and leads Be Smart, the Boston Consulting Group's Behavioral Economics and Behavioral Insights initiative. She champions the use of behavioral insights to improve product and service design and delivery across multiple sectors in almost every country that the firm works in. Second, for the two opposing the proposition, Dilip Soman is a professor at the University of Toronto, and his research is in the area of behavioral economics and its application to consumer well-being, marketing, and policy. He works with Ideas 42 and serves as an advisor to multiple welfare organizations. And finally, Gigi Foster is an associate professor with the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales. She works in many fields, including education, social influence, corruption, lab experiments, time use, behavioral economics, and Australian policy, publishing in a wide variety of economics and multidisciplinary outlets. Thank you again for joining us, each of you. We'll close the baseline poll now. I told you we care about data and evaluation. We also care about behavioral biases, such as anchoring. So I will not show you the results of that poll just yet. We'll wait until after the debate and after the final vote. Finally, I want to remind you again that you will have 10 minutes in the middle of the debate to ask your own questions or offer points that haven't been addressed. So start thinking about those as you listen. And without any further delay, I will turn it over to David. Thank you.
Right, very nice to be here. So this is an unusual format, isn't it? The other thing you might want to know is just before, we had a long briefing about this, and actually we thought we were arguing on the other side with a brilliant piece, I assume, of behavioral science. At the last minute, it's been reversed. So you may take no clue, of course, as to what we will or won't say on the back of that. But but actually, I mean, let's use the format, I think, hopefully to have a bit of fun, but also to flush out some more serious issues that might actually matter to many people. So I'm going to open the argument about that there are no easy wins left. I'm going to kind of have two parts to what I'm just going to lay out. One is that actually the premise is just wrong. I realize that's possibly Oxbridge tradition, but I think it might actually be true in this case. And then, as far as will we brush over that, well, actually, why is it, why is it there might be no easy wins left? So why might the premise be wrong, and therefore our learned opponents are in trouble from before they even begun? Which is that the implication of there's no easy wins is that there were easy wins before, but there are no easy wins left now, right? Well, why do you think there were easy wins before? And the reason why I think this actually matters beyond the semantic point is that there are lots of people who are trying and are starting up behavioral insight teams or are moving down this kind of journey, and you know what, you're actually going to find it's really hard. Like, oh my God, So I just want to lay bare a little bit from someone who's been doing this for a while in our team, certainly through, actually not just 2010, to be honest. We were doing it before that, and maybe I'll talk a bit about that. But if you were there at the time, it wasn't easy. And so a lot of the stories which we now say and look back and say, oh yeah, that was neat, or Alex sat there in terms of New South Wales or whatever. Now it looks easy in retrospect, but it wasn't easy at the time. And it's worth really remembering that for those of us who are still in the kind of the battles that go in, day by day. But certainly for those of you who are earlier in the journey. So let's just think about some classic ones. Well, pensions. Pensions default. We all know it's the golden kid of behavioral science, right? Change the default. It's worked in 401k in the US. We changed it in the UK in 2012, so on and so on. Fantastic results. 91% of people stick with the default. Oh my God, it's brilliant. Of course it's brilliant. We got 10 million people extra saving, we think, in the UK since we changed the defaults, even starting in 2012. Well, was it easy? No. How long did it take us to get the default in place? So, look, I'm old now, right? So, fairly old. I feel pretty old. Certainly sit next to some people. When I worked for Tony Blair, and I worked for him for 6 years, we were working on this issue. When Danny Kahneman came in to see us, before he had a Nobel Prize and talked about interesting ideas, he's talking about this interesting new paper about Save More Tomorrow, et cetera, and blah, blah, blah. You might want to look at that. So, I remember sending, in fact, the paper to Adair Turner, who did the review on pensions, saying, I think it's a really interesting paper. But it took huge consultations. It took certainly a decade to get from that point to the point at which we were able to implement. And with loads of wobbles along the way. Look, we changed prime ministers, and a new prime minister, frankly, wasn't that keen on the policy. Why do we want to tell all these businesses and change the default, and so on and so on? So pensions wasn't easy. Well, let's think about some of the other ones. Sam at the front, remember the stuff we did on DWP? Job centers, whatever you call them, something else, sorry. Where unemployed folks get, and we try and get them back into work. We had to basically run a guerrilla operation under the noses of our department, who looked after them, to try and get in those centers, figure out what was going on. Could we make these changes? For God's sake, don't tell the top of the department, because we got hope and hell maybe of getting some of these things through before we get shut down on it. I often thought of the metaphor. It's like you're dealing with this great sort of dinosaur and its long tail. You can kind of tweak the tail, and if you're really fast and effective about it, you might get it before the signal's gone to the brain and all the way back to say, what the hell are you doing down there? So it was really difficult, and then, of course, you've got to persuade lots of people to actually do it in the field, etc. Or even another classic one, organ donation, another default one. Right, oh, it's easy, blah, blah, blah. We did a trial, some of you might know it, 1 million people going through it. We tried 8 variations, different kinds of prompts, got a neat result, etc. Fine, you get about 400,000 people extra on the register from putting this prompt in place, about an extra 100,000 in relation to a better worded quote, very neat. Actually, the truth is we didn't get the design we wanted. We didn't want to do any of those. What we really wanted to do was a required or a prompted choice, where when you were getting your car tax, you would have to answer the question, yes or no, basically. We couldn't get it through the lawyers, so the thing we had to do is to sort of stick on at the end, which is a golden page form. So, in sum, we'll come back to other arguments later on, I do think this fundamental premise is wrong. It's never been that easy. That isn't to say that our fundamental objective shouldn't be to make it feel easy and seem easy to the citizen who is using these services, but that doesn't mean it's easy for those of us who are trying to do the work. I'll just mention, just to set up the argument, we'll come back to it, are there other things we'll come on to? Yeah. Is scaling easy? Once we figure it out, we'll do it everywhere. Does anybody in policy think that's true? I don't think so. Let alone before we move on to what are the key challenges, the wicked challenges, the complex things which we are wrestling with, beastie, group conflict, etc. Do they sound easy? I don't think so. So, in sum, I think the premise is wrong, which I think hopefully you will take some comfort from, or at least some realism. And when you look at the big challenges, which I think we should be taking on, they don't look easy either. Thank you.
Dilip for 7.
All right. So I'm actually going to begin this debate by saying I agree with David that it wasn't easy, right? But the one claim I will make is I think it is much more easy today than it was when you first set up the nudge unit. It's easier today to score easy wins, and going forward, it's going to be easier. And with appropriate investments, it's going to get even more easier going forward. Now, of course, we can debate on the semantics of easy and what easy means and what is an easy win and so on and so forth. But I'm going to make 6 points as to why I think it's going to get easier. I'll run through them, then I'll make a confession, and then I'll pass it back to you, Julia. So, 6 things. You talked about scaling being difficult. It's difficult, but there is one aspect of scaling that we haven't really done well, which is horizontal scaling. So what do I mean by horizontal scaling? The point is that every complex policy challenge has, at its foundation, 3 or 4 basic behavioral challenges. We need to get people to comply. We need to get people to switch from option A to option B. We need to get people to consume information, consume products, consume services. And we need to get them to accelerate behavior, which is stuff that they were going to do downstream, later on, tomorrow. We need to get them to do it today. And I think every single complex policy challenge can be then broken down into a series of these behavioral challenges. We just haven't done enough of learning from one policy area and then horizontally scaling it to the other kinds of policy areas. So I think there's a heck of a lot of easy wins in taking our learning from financial services and financial inclusion and well-being and healthcare to other things like climate change and immigration and whatever else. So horizontal scaling, I think, is going to get easier as we go through. Geography. I mean, you look at the map that the OECD puts out. They put out one recently, was it 3 months ago, with 110 behavioral units all over the world. There's a huge gray block in the middle. And the world's most populous nations are there. You look at India, you look at China, Russia. There's so many easy wins there to take a lot of the ideas that, David, you and your team have seeded us with and apply them to different geographies and different kinds of problems. So I think there's a lot of easy wins there. Today, compared to 2010, which is when you started off, we have access to way more resources than we ever did. For example, data collection platforms, right? So it's difficult to do a trial. You could actually do something like an online platform and collect data. We have access to more data sets, more generally. Companies and governments have been much better about collecting, sorting, sifting, organizing, collating data. Wasn't the case in 2010. So I imagine it was really hard when you did your first trial. Not as hard today, given that we have access to a lot of data. A lot of data is digital today. It wasn't the case back in 2010. Data sharing is an amazing thing that this community has done so well. So I know Ideas 42 has started this sort of repository of trials and generalization, and just a simple meta-analysis of that data to get a sense of what works where and where not is an easy win. I mean, that is a super easy win. And I think that will help a lot of units all across the world stop reinventing the wheel. And then machine learning. I think the whole notion of AI will help us better understand and diagnose problems. And we can actually move behavioral science from a problem solving to a stopping a problem kind of initiative. And I think that's another potential easy win. So that's the third thing, which is that we have access to more resources. Put into that things like labs and hubs. I mean, there's just so many more now. Lots of qualified personnel. We actually have programs now that train people to do this kind of stuff, which we didn't have even 5 or 6 years ago. Point number 4, the canvas of behavioral science applications is huge. And I'm just going to touch on this briefly. So a lot of the units have been focused on sort of these last mile, touch point, change kind of interventions. But there's a heck of a lot more we could do. At this conference, we've learned about design thinking and machine learning. And how do we think about new products that help people exert self-control, or developing decision tools? I mean, there's a lot of stuff we could do there that I would put under the easy win bucket. Couple of last points. One is that we have a lot more mechanisms today of engaging with the crowd, engaging with the citizens. So hackathons. I mean, who had done hackathons back in 2010? Today, you have a problem to solve. You toss it out, invite a bunch of young college kids. They'll do it much better than we can do it. And those mechanisms exist, and I think that's amazing. That's completely going to change the way we can draw on the expertise of the crowd to solve behavioral challenges. And then finally, number 6, I think as the cost of experimentation declines over time, we will start to see a greater use of experimentation. Simple economics, laws of demand and supply, things become cheaper, you use them more. And the cost is not just the cost of collecting data or the cost of actually analyzing data, but things like mindsets. I mean, mindsets of people in administration have changed significantly. Ethics, we now have a code of conduct that Cass laid out for us. We're starting to see prime ministers and ministers, at least in Canada and I'm sure elsewhere, talk about the fact that failure isn't failure. You actually learn something from experiments that haven't worked. So I'd say given all of those things, the cost of experimentation overall is going to go down. I think I have a minute left, so I'm going to make a confession, which is when I first was asked to participate in this debate, and I was told that David was on the other side, I was actually scared. I mean, here's a person who set up the first ever behavioral insights unit, and in fact is in many ways responsible for us all being here. So I did what I do when I'm scared, which is I went to Twitter and said, how do I debate with David Halpern? And I got a whole bunch of suggestions, including a few from Richard Thaler. He said, talk about e-cigarettes or confuse him with cricket. And that was on the 10th of June, which was the day that I think Scotland beat England. And I'm sure the English team felt at that point in time that there were no more easy wins. But then along came the Australians. And if the English team could have easy wins, this crowd will definitely have easy wins going forward. So thank you.
Julia for 7.
It's good to see that we have got off on a starting point of some really high quality sledging, which for our non-Commonwealth friends in the audience is sometimes called banter or roasting, to get us deep into the complexity of this topic. To kind of pick up on this vein of argument from Dilip, the fact that the behavioral insights community and the way in which we practice it now is better resourced and better connected isn't a signal that it's easier. It's actually a signal and a recognition of the deep complexity and difficulty associated with doing that work, that we actually now have a more nuanced understanding of just how challenging it is to actually operationalize some of this. So David's already kind of begged the question for you. He said, did these easy wins ever exist? And offered you this kind of lens of saying, back in the day when we were trekking 5 miles through the snow to do our first RCT, It was genuinely very difficult, and it remains persistently difficult today. But even if that's not persuasive to you, let's actually look at the environment today. Let's say even if that's not the case, and we think it is, what are the ways in which the environment for behavioral insights, the way in which we get these wins, what does it actually look like? And there's a couple of challenges I want to touch on. One is this one that Dilip mentioned, which is about the challenge of scale and how we actually get outside of the team and into the broad policy-making environment. The second is how we actually proliferate into more complex environments with more complex government organizations and into more complex topics. Then the third is how do we actually create some reach, and that's reach deep inside government. It might be surprising, basking in the kind of warm glow of the last 2 days, but for most, if not all governments, behavioral insights is still not business as usual, that it is not government as practiced in the day-to-day sense for most of the policy making, most of the operations of government. That will be immensely challenging to actually change the business of government. So Dilip talks a lot about behaviorally informed organization. The idea that you might have a behaviorally informed government or even a behaviorally informed agency is an enormous challenge. That is the next frontier, and figuring out how we overcome that will absolutely not be straightforward. I think it's also worth us spending a little bit of time and reflecting, and in the Q&A I'd be interested in the points of view from people around the world. I think it is fair to say in some of the geographies in which people come from and in which we work, we are not in a fact-seeking age. People have decided that not only are they entitled to their own opinions, they're also entitled to their own facts, both inside government and in the public discourse. And if that's the case, it becomes much harder to be the kind of bulwark for science, for reason, for constructive debate, and for experimentation. And then finally, we have created something of a rod for our own backs, that there's kind of this design bias that says, just because we have set out to make something easy doesn't mean that it was easy to do. In fact, there's probably an inversely proportional relationship there. And that we, of course, end up producing delightful publications. We talk well and articulately about the success that teams have. And that's a wonderful and important part of the mission, but necessarily creates a different kind of publication bias towards focusing on successes and distracting people from the way in which that's challenging, either in the process or the initiatives that actually didn't work. So let me talk a little bit about those kind of complex, multifaceted challenges. I read recently that typically the outcome that a practitioner is aiming to influence is the culmination of a number of smaller decisions and actions. And that one of the biggest challenges is to trigger the recognition of, for instance, health and wealth management in this case. And we have started to think briefly about how we do instigate those triggers, but haven't yet moved to the next complex level. I mean, that tremendously important insight comes from a book that I absolutely commend to you. It's called The Last Mile. It's by Professor Dilip Soman. It's tremendous. But we have only begun to scratch the surface of that kind of complexity, both in terms of the geographies in which we operate. And Dilip highlighted some of those, that there are environments, Russia is a good example, where you don't necessarily have the public consent for the work that you're trying to do, for the scrutiny. We don't yet have an operating paradigm to think about how you would work in a context like that and what might or might not be valid. Similarly, thinking about the topics, the truly wicked problems that actually beset all kinds of societies. Like, what is it that drives tendencies towards violent extremism? How do you create a situation in which people have purpose and happiness at work? The vast majority of adults in the West continue to feel like they are unhappy and purposeless at work, despite the fact that that's where they spend most of their time. How do we help people think about rising sea levels in a way that allows them to take action? How do we protect endangered species that are not adorable but essential? All of those are solutions that you might imagine have behavioral levers that allow you to intervene on them. We haven't even begun to think about how we do that. And then part of that is because we don't yet have this reach, this kind of proliferation deep inside the government. So being able to move not just outside the lab or move beyond the trial to scale, but actually to scale behavioral insights itself as a capability or an operating competency deep inside the government. So to say, it's not a set of capacities that sits outside here. It's not an advisory service that you call upon. It is the way we do business. We are a behaviorally informed government or a behaviorally informed agency. I think it goes without saying that that kind of challenge, it might be surmountable, but is extremely difficult. And all of those challenges are tremendously worthwhile. They're all designed in the spirit of actually making the good choices easy. Worthwhile for sure, but extremely difficult at the same time.
Gigi for 7.
Thank you very much, Julia, and everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. This is so much fun. So I'm going to start by reiterating that we agree with the opposing side that indeed the proposition as stated is faulty because it has the implication that there have been easy wins. And then the question is, well, what are we really arguing against? Are we actually arguing against your, stated straw man of, wins are, now really easy? Well, no, that's not necessarily what we were told to do. So we can debate for a million years about whether the gradient is going up or going down, and that's not really what we were asked to do. So I would submit to you that it's a bit of a cheap shot. But I want to expand the debate here somewhat. Now, I will say when Shay introduced all of us, he specifically interpreted the question to mean something in the context of BI units, how much easier it would be for BI units to do their work. As a behavioral economist in the academy, that is not the interpretation that I place on it. There is a much broader suite of things that come to my mind when I think about behavioral economics, and Dilip referred to this a bit. I think about an applied behavioral insight, which is what's in our proposition, as essentially any type of situation where you know that you're using, and this was the definition you gave us, Jay, you're using system 1 and system 2 thinking to make a decision. Right? Some sort of bias or cognitive, heuristic or something that comes to you and you follow it somehow because in that decision-making context, you are using system 1 and system 2, conscious and unconscious. I put to you that is the case in every decision that human makes. And so to that extent, the fact that economics has now admitted of a broader and richer model of human decision-making in the last 20 to 30 years, our models are much richer than what we started with the Samuelson sort of thing and what we had in the 1940s, 1950s, means immediately that we have to have more of a framework on which to build a better understanding of the human complexity in decision-making. And that essentially means that the world, the gauntlet, is thrown down to us to simply take our understandings about system 2 and how it interacts with system 1, when we can control ourselves, when we can't, and place that into a myriad of different contexts. So as an academic, again, I have to say, things like, for example, why people pay taxes so easily. We didn't used to really get that, right? Economists used to sort of say, well, you just need to increase penalties and then, people will pay tax more. Well, no, we now understand that people pay taxes basically because they're loyal to their state at some level. There's an instinctive habituation to the notion of paying taxes. We have this mental model of the way our societies work. Okay, and that means that we need to pay taxes in order to get this reciprocal exchange with our societies. 30 years ago, we didn't have a model in economics about that. So the fact that we have it means we can think better about it now. And so the scope for application to governmental decision-making and policy is that much more expanded. Social benchmarking as well. We didn't used to have models of that. Now we have not just Akerlof and Cranton, but a bajillion other models of how societies influence individuals and groups influence individuals. That means we can use that knowledge, not to sound like Machiavelli, but we can use that knowledge to create better policy that uses the fact that we know people are vulnerable to social benchmarking. I would also say, and we've heard this earlier in the conference, there are huge gains to be had by in individual lives in terms of productivity when we support both System 1 and System 2 thinking in a given scenario. So yesterday I was listening to John List talking about the parenting practices stuff that he's doing. And the idea here is that you provide parents who are disadvantaged in some way with a basic heuristic for how to mother their children or parent their children better. So talk to the child as you're dressing the child. Boy, is that easy. If you can reach those people, and he seems to be doing it, and get the kids spoken to as their brain is developing, immediately you've got decades of return, right? Which we just didn't have before. So there's just incredible scope there for using our understanding of the importance of things like ego and locus of control and confidence and all this sort of stuff in supporting people's development and their decision making and their needs in a decision making context to make those decisions be more productive and more welfare enhancing. I would also, as an economist, just point to the fact that we look for market-based evidence for any claim that we want to make. And economic and management consulting is a thriving business. And I'm sure many of you in the room know this, right? Now, it wouldn't be a thriving business if there weren't some value being had out of that consulting. And that consulting is indeed often considering problems about human decision-making, context and individual characteristics, conditional on all that stuff, what is a better thing for the organization to do? That is applied behavioral insights if you've never, at a very, very basic level. So I think that's market-based evidence that there is a booming business in using behavioral insights to improve things on the ground in the private sector and also even in the public sector. And finally, I want to remind everybody that the goal of economics is to enhance welfare, human welfare, right? And there are huge and easy gains available in the lives of every single person in this room, I would venture, from simply applying what we now know about the way people make decisions to your own life. Right? So, if you accept yourself as a greedy person, sure, everybody has greed. Evolutionarily, good reasons for it, fine. Don't be ashamed, don't be guilty. At the same time, you have loyalties and loves, and that's okay, and that's human, and it's a good thing. You have sex drives, that's okay. You have drives for status, that's okay. Once we just accept ourselves in this way, we have this universe of possibility to explore more and to get more out of ourselves and also to be happier. In a general sense for governments, accepting that there are these sorts of realities about humans is very helpful for generating policies that will actually, target humans rather than a cardboard cutout, which is what used to be in the economic models that governments would use. So finally, just in terms of the broad point that was made by the other point just recently, policymakers sometimes are faced with constraints that we in academia don't face. And yes, understanding how to change a whole government or a whole society in terms of the norms is incredibly difficult, and we would never argue that that's going to be an easy win. But that's not the only kind of win that is targeted here. And I would put to you that there are insights from behavioral economics itself which allow us to understand why policymakers feel the way they do, why the systems are the way they do, and we can use those insights to better influence the policies. And to understand how to get into India, how to get into China, what will work. So the very science that we are, trying to apply in a sort of a BI unit can be used to understand why that BI unit is having problems. So it's a kind of a meta thing. Right? So a few other points that we can make, but I'm sure they'll come up later.
David, 5-minute rebuttal.
Okay, when are we bringing in the audience?
After this round of rebuttals.
Okay, fine. Just want to make sure we are going to. All right, very good. Well, look, this is all very much fun, isn't it? Let me just pick up on a couple of issues. So about this, it's great, and Dilip, you made the point, and it's absolutely right. I certainly hope it's true that it is getting easier in at least some domains. I hope it's getting easier in many governments politically to make the case. You can point to a backlog of examples and wins, much more than we had in 2010 for sure. I hope data should be making it easier and integrate data sets of various kinds to run experiments and lower the costs, and that would be a wonderful thing to have happen. So I really hope that's true. Also, let's acknowledge, I think we would all agree surely, that there are definitely easier wins. It's a really important point. So there's a portfolio of things. We all have to judge where we use our capital, our time, and our people. We should try and figure out where are the easier wins where we will get those good returns. That is really worth thinking through. That's not, of course, what we're saying here. If it said there are no more easier wins, there's definitely easier wins, and it's worth being systematic in identifying those. But let's just be clear about what does easy look like? What is the relevant comparison, right? Easy is basically carrying on doing what we did yesterday in our legacy services, right? And our welfare systems, et cetera. That's what easy is. That's what we do day in, day out, right? Easy is writing a manifesto and say, we're going to do this thing, and like, we're definitely not going to test it, we're just going to do it everywhere, right? That's what we do day in, day out. So that's what easy really looks like day in, day out. It's much harder to break out of your prior patterns, conceptions, and certainly scrutinize what you're doing and subject to it to test. But again, on the deeper point, what I think we're in the room for really especially, is that my view is we should also be running to the challenge, right? So let's pursue the easier wins where we get higher rates of return. Let's definitely do that. But let us also challenge ourselves to go for the more difficult, the more complex, the most disadvantaged who are getting caught up in our systems and could do better. You know, there are so many of those opportunities in a range of areas. We should take them on. We should take on the more difficult challenges. And finally, like, it's worthwhile, right? It's really worth doing that. You know, I'm going to start early in a second. To try and say, well, let us carry on with the fight. And in that sense, it may definitely be worth us at least entertaining the fantasy on a Monday morning that there are easy wins so that we carry on trying, even though, in fact, we need to steel ourselves to the fact that most of those, in fact, won't be done by Tuesday or Wednesday or the week after that, right? So, yeah, I'll kind of conclude there, really. I think easy is for status quo, and we've got a lot of battles still, I think, ahead of us. But let's pursue the easier, and let's also run to the challenge.
Thank you. Dilip, 5 minutes.
All right. David, what you said was easy sounds like lazy to me, not easy. I mean, just doing what we were doing in the past. So I'm going to try and put a different frame on what easy means. And the beautiful book that Julia talked about, The Last Mile, in there somewhere, there's an anecdote about 4 people that go to a bar, and the bartender basically says, everybody is drinking, like, you know, this particular beer, I want them to get them to switch. And so the lawyer goes in first and says, well, let's just restrict access to beer A. Like, let's pass a law making A illegal. And then the economist comes in and says, no, it's all about incentives, so, you know, give them discounts or give them a voucher or whatever else. The marketing person wants to give lots of information. We know that that doesn't work particularly well because when you give people lots of information, they don't actually read it. And then finally, the behavioral scientist comes in and says, well, just make B the default and let people opt out and switch to A if they want to. That's easy. It's easier than passing a law, you know, banning A. It's easier than spending lots of money on incentives that we know the moment you withdraw the incentives that, in fact, people are going to go back and revert to their usual behavior, and it's easier than giving people lots of information. So I think in the context of behavior change, I would still argue that you know, everything we do in terms of the last mile kind of interventions and some of the ones that you talked about are easy compared to other things that governments could do to engineer the same behavior. Let me also talk about a couple of other things. One having to do with sort of the comment I made about having that repository of information, the data set, the learnings. And I wish somebody just did a simple meta-analysis of all of that data. And I'm hoping that that gets done soon. But you don't have to wait for a meta-analysis. So I was actually in India recently and spoke to a company that was actually employing text analysis and machine learning to go through all of our academic papers, as well as the reports that you're holding, to try and cull out sort of general themes that, you know, it seems like framing seems to work under conditions where these sorts of things happen. And I think that's a great easy win for us. Is the moment we have insights like that, I think it would be of tremendous help for units going forward, because now we don't spend our time trying things that work somewhere else, but we're not quite sure are going to work here or not. And then just a third quick thing, and I will pass it back to you, which is the notion of, you know, in governments, when you're trying to solve the big wicked problems, you're absolutely right, it's not easy no matter what you do. But you chip away, and you chip away, and it's like cutting down a tree. You keep chipping till you find the weak spot. And it's not hard, right? I mean, if you go into the act of cutting a tree and saying, I need to know before I start cutting the tree exactly at which angle I'm going to hit the axe, It's hard, it's difficult, right? But if you chip away and you sort of test and nudge, and I'm using your language, test, learn, adapt, you'll get there pretty quickly. And to me, I think that kind of, the whole notion of test, learn, adapt captures the ease of this approach. Julia.
5 minutes, Julia.
I think one thing we want to be careful as we have this conversation is not mistaking velocity for ease. So this idea that we have been able to grow the field and the practice of the field very fast and in some cases quite broadly around the world. And also not mistaking cheapness for ease. So the idea that either something is cheap to institute as an intervention or certainly cheaper than it was doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy or that you're able, that it's predictably kind of adapted to the context. And something that maybe has been a little under-discussed over the last day and a half, but perhaps we can get into in the Q&A is, it won't be a surprise to everyone in the room that there's a crisis of replication in the social sciences, in economics, in social psychology. So perhaps to the extent that there were some of these easy wins, these easy observations, some of them perhaps ought not to have been, and that actually building these kind of generalizable, replicable insights is actually harder than we might have first imagined. That you really on a first principles basis of making sure that foundational understanding is also really robust. That's basically a challenge that we'll revisit in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And so even as these teams grow, even as they become, in Gigi's words, kind of self-diagnosing, that you're able to turn behavioral insights on ourselves to think about how we become more productive inside the team, how you nudge the nudges, to use the parlance of one of our breakout sessions earlier. All of those things are useful, valuable, extremely worthwhile. But to borrow David's framing from earlier, are still incredibly difficult. Even if they are getting progressively easier as we have a broader arsenal of tools. I'm not even certain that that's the case, but even if they are, thinking about how you actually bring all of those tools to bear in ways that is adapted to the context is really critical. And part of that is actually beginning to move outside of countries that look like this one or countries that look like the United Kingdom, and going into an environment where not only are budgets extremely constrained, where you might not have either the financial wherewithal or the human capability to begin to institute some of these interventions, that will require a genuinely novel approach to thinking about how you scale, how you expand in that kind of environmental setting. And I think for me at least, it's virtually impossible to argue that one ought not do that. I think you can kind of argue the reverse, right? That there's an obligation to do that, to look for transferability into those contexts. But it will be a supreme challenge even to pick up this kind of easy analysis, to lift those meta-analyses and say, well, it's kind of, we've generally observed that framing is suitable in this kind of context. We think it's plausible that a default might work just as well here in Central America in this tax-paying context as it might work elsewhere. Isn't necessarily so, that requires a kind of rigorous commitment and robust testing that I think we all aspire to. And then the other part of this that I really wrestle with is even some of our most studied problems, compliance, simplification, even those most studied, most attended to problems remain unsolved in a strict sense. There remains still this pretty big gap of citizens who haven't been reached, who are seemingly impervious to that intervention. And that's not a lack of wisdom or attention or effort going onto that problem. It's that is that last mile. It's bridging that gap that is really persistently very challenging. And it's not because people haven't tried or they haven't tried hard enough. It's because those wins are really, really hard and probably always were.
and Gigi for 5.
So I want to start by recollecting something that Cassandra said at the start of this conference, which is at the very end of his talk. He said, what is the scarcest resource that humans have? It's time. And so I guess from my perspective, again, as an academic, thinking about how we apply behavioral insights, it is thinking about the value of our time, the value of our attention, and knowing that we are vulnerable to having that attention drawn away through smartphones and Twitter feeds and all this. I'm not even on Twitter, right? Because I can self-manage with this meta-knowledge, right? And so when we think about wins, what is a win, right? What's a low cost? And easy has to mean something. So it has to mean something in the area of cost, either monetary or non-monetary. So in terms of my time and my money, what is a low-cost way to get a big improvement in my welfare? Turn off my phone at dinner. Done. Right? And there are so many little things like that. Right? Expose yourself to contrast. Be hungry when you eat. Be sleepy when you sleep, because you'll enjoy your food and your sleep more. Right? We know that all perception flows through contrast now, and not just from experimental studies in psychology, but because we've seen it in economics, and we've brought it into our models. And I want to make a further point about those models. So the fact that we are increasingly seeing extensions of the traditional, conventional cardboard cutout of a man models in economics means that we're going to have more and more ability to understand why these problems of uptake are there. What exactly are the functions underlying uptake? What are the barriers, and how are people thinking? What are their mental models about things? And in a wonderful book, which I commend to you, called An Economic Theory of Greed, Love, Groups, and Networks, which I published with Paul Freiters about 5 years ago, we are exactly intending to do that. And there are more and more authors who are trying to come to terms with what we actually, would like to say is a broad social science model of humanity and its societies. An individual is not just an atomistic, selfish decision maker. He is someone inevitably linked with all of the others in his life, the groups and the people. We are only what we are to other people at a very, very basic level. And that's the way, economics used to be back in the day that it was collinear with psychology and sociology and everything else back in the 1700s. Now, we are increasingly trying to re-expand and see those things, which gives us, if nothing else, a broader perspective and broader palette from which to select colors to try to make inroads in the way that you're thinking. Now, I would never disagree that, there are always going to be a few people that are going to be harder to reach. There's just, there's heterogeneity in the society. So anytime that's the case, sure. And early on in the BI revolution, there were, as you say, people sort of running around saying, oh, this is really easy, let's just do this, let's do this. But those were not actually wins. So I would argue, it wasn't like those were easy wins, those were easy non-wins. And as our models get better, the wins that we can potentially draw from those models are more winning. They're more likely to actually win because they're informed by a broader and more accurate understanding of how people really make decisions and what they're influenced by and how we can therefore reach them. So I would say, in terms of the things that people in the audience can take away, ask yourself, is it easy for you if you decided in one moment, if you got all caught up with, oh, behavioral insights can help me, is there one thing you could think of that you could do to improve your life or the life of somebody you love today? Yes. Surely, talk more to your children. Turn your phone off at dinner. Have a reminder set to do something that you've been wanting to do. Schedule time on a weekend just where you're going away from the house and you're going to do something you've really been wanting to do and you've been putting it off. Schedule the time, because then you're committed, right? Use the behavioral insights that we've seen at this conference to structure your life so you get more out of it. That is an easy win using applied behavioral insights.
Thank you very, very much. And now it's over to the audience for about 15 minutes. Again, if you have any questions or points that you don't feel have been adequately addressed, please feel free. This gentleman.
Sam Haynes from the Behavioral Insights team. Just like to say that I've worked with...
Hold on, Sam.
Thank you. Sam Haynes from the Behavioral Insights team. I've worked with David for 8 years, and I'd just like to say this may be the first time he's ever acknowledged that the work we do is difficult.
I thought you say, sorry, I'm not supposed to intervene, but Actually, but working together has been very difficult. Like, it's never been easy working with David or anyone else on the team. I was so pleased what you actually said. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Cassie. I have two roles, one at the University of Melbourne School of Psychology, but also I have a research consultancy. And I guess, so from both of those posts, I'm an outsider looking into government. And I guess my perspective is that in this policy area, you're doing great work in behavioural insights and applying those insights. And then you walk down the hall to your communications departments, and there's this over-reliance on focus groups for testing the consumer-facing messages that go out from government. And you know, I've felt this real resistance from anything other than focus groups when it comes to testing your actual messages that go out to public, whether it be a brochure or a leaflet or an ad or anything like that. And I guess to me, I see this real disconnect between the wonderful work that's going on in these policy areas and then this sort of older-fashioned way of looking at you know, getting people to sit in a group, often about sensitive topics about money or health or whatever, and then get them to predict how they might respond to a certain ad, and then using that as the only evidence for an ad going ahead or not. I guess it's sort of what you said, Julia, about behavioural insights being seen as a very distinct, separate unit, and certainly not something that, you know, I see in the communications or marketing or advertising side of things. So I guess it was more just a reflection, but also wanting to hear your thoughts on whether you think an easy win, if we're using that term, is to get your communications areas more, I guess, educated on that focus groups are not the be-all and end-all, and probably often not the most appropriate way of testing how people respond to the communications that come out of government.
So maybe make a comment on that. I think that it's a very fair observation, and it reminds me of an observation made by a colleague I spoke to yesterday at lunch who had a sojourn in the Department of Education, and she herself is a PhD-trained economist, and she said it was life-sucking to be in that environment where everyone is a teacher or has teaching background, and there has been no education of those people in relation to what it is to, you know, approach a problem scientifically with evidence, with, you know, an RCT-style framework, right? The mental model is just different about how one should do what one is supposedly supposed to do, and even what is the objective is sometimes just completely different. And so what this shows is merely that people are the product of indoctrination. Yeah. So changing that is equivalent to what Julie was talking about, changing whole societies or norms within departments of government. That is frigging difficult. That is not where the easy wins are. But we know now what the first step would be, which is get into the curriculum. Get into whatever training program people go through, who then ultimately come out and staff those policy units, whether it's HSC, whether it's, you know, TAFE or, you know, PhD land or whatever. Get yourself, figure out ways in which to infiltrate into the systems that make people's mental models, that they then carry with them throughout life. Because that is, you know, we know now that is basically how people operate. It's not like, you know, there's an unlimited amount of time to make a decision, right? You're relying on heuristics that are built through indoctrination.
So I'm going to jump in as well. I think the first thing I'll say is that actually doing focus groups is better than doing nothing at all, which I've seen some departments do. But I think the easy win approach to getting people away from focus groups into a trial thing is to try some sort of a hybrid approach. So for example, we had a department in Canada that was basically stuck up on doing interviews, right? And we know that interviews have inherent limitations. But the way we do interview now is to actually show people two designs and say, which one would you like more, right? And then why? And so kind of make it like a within-subject experiment. And over time, I think they got the idea that if, in fact, this was a between-subject experiment, that you would get better insight. So I think it's easy to start small and work your way and keep chipping away. But if you go in and say, well, you know, focus groups aren't the right thing and we should do an experiment, then you're going to get the difficult to win world to deal with. So chipping away, I think, is the way to do it. It's easy.
Yeah, but it is a very particular lens on it, isn't it? I'm thinking about things like like in a kind of impeccably designed letter trial, like, you know, beautiful and very robust, until it meets kind of the like dual forces of legal and communications inside an agency, and then like what looked like, you know, very robust kind of disintegrates under the weight of those two. It does strike me that there is an opportunity there to think about your kind of BI capability, your legal teams and your communications teams, and how they kind of come together in some happy tripartite marriage. Yeah.
That'd be an easy win.
Maybe.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Cassandra Lomai from Department of Human Services. My question links back to Gigi. You mentioned early wins means better practices. And my question, I suppose, is there a risk that if we're missing the complexity of those key findings by taking those easy wins, I mean, are we missing the bigger picture?
Oh, I absolutely think that the bigger picture is a work in progress. Absolutely, there's no question. Every model is wrong. I mean, every model will be wrong for the next 5 generations anyway, right? So, I mean, even to an approximation relevant for policy, every model will still be wrong in 5 generations, right? So, yeah, but that's, I mean, that the fact that you even want a perfect model shows that, you know, what you're going for is an ideological thing. It's a purity of purpose. And then forget about that. In the real world of messy, complex human behavior, you've got to go with practical steps. Practical, as you say, chipping away at bits and pieces that you think are, you know, that's likely because it's worked there, and this is very similar, and let's go. Right? So I think that exists. And it has been massively underexploited in many cases because people get blinded by, you know, oh, we need the perfect, you know, and that is the perfect being the enemy of the good situation, right? So yeah, I think that's true. Now, I would always argue that we should keep trying to push towards a more accurate, more complex, but still tractable model of how people really make decisions. And at the end of the day, that's the blue sky research area that will eventually generate implications that will make all of our wins, you know, easier down the track. But the fact that we're even thinking about that now is great, you know. We weren't thinking about that 30 years ago, right? The siloization was almost something, a point of pride. Finance broke off from economics back in the 1950s. We were still doing divergence back in the 1950s. We're now starting to see a bit of convergence, right? And that means that that's going to have all sorts of benefits in, hopefully, you know, my children's generation. So yeah, I agree, but I think there's, you know, there's still a lot of easy things.
But I also think that the argument isn't that we should only be going after the easy wins. I mean, I don't think that's, you said that, I didn't say that. In fact, we shouldn't do that, right? There are easy wins, and the more of those easy wins you score, the easier it becomes to score the difficult wins, because the difficult ones become easier with more easy. Does that?
Yep.
I sound like I'm in Yes, Prime Minister or something.
Yes, Sir Humphrey.
Yeah.
Sorry, my name's Elizabeth from the the Innovation Exchange within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Just a question. So you talk about easy and hard, and it was very good to bring up the time. You know, we work with the SDGs and delivering to, and different countries will have different stages of being able to identify the behavioral insights. But one of the dilemmas is that you have to deliver against indicators, you know, and you have 2 years to reduce obesity or, you know, get rid of, to reduce smoking or whatever those really hard outcomes are. So when you talk about easy wins, I think about what are some of the things that you can bang for your buck that you can say you've delivered against the outcome. So as we move towards the SDGs, 2020, you know, can you just speak a little bit about that? I don't know, either team.
Shall I start? Look, they're great challenges, and many governments have wrestled because of their relativity. Actually, when you look at them, they're not that easy from where you are now. I think what they do illustrate, I mean, by the way, look, let's aim high. Let's try and fix global warming and obesity and lots of other things, and poverty. What I think they often are is it would be easy, and then if, in brackets, if it wasn't also true that there are all these other barriers that make it difficult. We have a house, you mentioned e-cigarettes, and they're not very popular in Australia. We think they've been incredibly effective as a way, with some substantial evidence, we made them more available in the UK, a way of increasing quit rates, they're 60% more effective. You offer a substitution. There's certainly, I think, for many smokers, their experience is easy. So on the face of it, it's like, well, come on, guys, what's the problem then? Why are you Australians so hung up on the problem with e-cigarettes, for God's sake? Well, there are legal issues and there are public health folks who have very sincere beliefs about their concerns and so on. So I think that's what we often see. We often see, let's face it, most of us have been in policy for a while. We have some things where we just think, I really think if we could do the following thing, it would help. And it would help with a number of these big challenges. But there are all these barriers which are really real, about legal barriers and political barriers, and the public isn't there ready yet, you know. So our challenge then becomes, maybe it's chopping down the tree, that's part of what you do. So you have to overcome all those barriers along the way. Myself, I'm an optimist, right? I think we can take on some of these great challenges. And just to, let's be upbeat about that bit, is that one of the really exciting things about the behavioral sciences have told us, as well as more empirical methods, is some of the challenges that, frankly, we didn't really think we could ever get cracked. We are going to get cracked. And I absolutely believe that's the case.
I think one thing about things like the SDGs, and particularly interim targets, is they're incredibly useful as a focusing device, right, for a government. If you're the donor country, if you're an aid recipient country, if you work at one of the multilaterals. But the problems we have in realizing them actually are, and I have a report out about this actually, but in realizing them are also problems of cooperation. Like, it doesn't appear when you look out at the available both public and private capital that there really is a scarcity of capital. What there is a kind of scarcity of projects, in this case, to realize the SDGs. And that scarcity of projects is actually a problem of cooperation. It's an inability of people who do actually have a shared interest to come together around that shared interest in a way that's value creating for everyone. So you hope that the focusing device itself brings the problem into sufficient focus for everyone, and then kind of crowds enough people into the frame that you begin to make progress on it. You can be kind of hopeful about that, but I think that the challenge is very material.
And I agree with the general idea of the fact that we've made progress in areas that we thought we'd never actually touch. I think that's impressive. The goals are interesting in that they are common across countries, common across jurisdictions. The problems are different, right? And so oftentimes you'll see there's a translation process where you say, if that's my SDG, what are my problems? What are your problems? And those problems are often different. They're behavioral problems. But I think to the point we can actually get down to the bark of the tree and figure out what the behavior change problems are. That part is the easy part, right? And then really chipping away is the difficult part. So to your point, I think it's really it's great to get started with the easy stuff. But as you go in, the difficult stuff becomes easier to see.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Brad?
Ben Newell, School of Psychology, UNSW. I wonder if the panel thinks in pursuing easy wins, whether you should focus on what works or why it works.
So I think it depends on who you are and what the audience is for your endeavor. So if you're in the academy, you want to know why it works. You want to be talking about mechanism, and you are a psychologist, I'm an economist. We were taught to think about deeper explanations for things, rather than just saying blindly in an empirical kind of way, oh, well, I've mined the data and here it is, this works, right? Because essentially that means if you've done that, then the external validity of what you have done is severely compromised, because you don't really know why you got what you got, and therefore what the conditions are that you would need to have in place to expect the same thing in another context. But I think a lot of situations, with regard to parenting, for example, even in schools, positive psychology programs in schools, for example, you can try out something, see if it works with a bunch of kids. If it seems to work, why not try that? And give at least as an opportunity, oh, you could do this program if you like, and you might get self-selection into a good thing, something that's helpful for kids. for those kids who know that they need it. So I think yeah, it does depend on if you're really at the coalface and you're trying to think of something under time pressure and financial pressure that might be okay. You can look at the literature and say, that might work. And there's at least some ideas out there. Better than we had 20 years ago when there wasn't really anything, and you kind of just had to, well, maybe this will work, right? Yuck. But if you're an academy, member, then it's much more of interest in the longer run, and I think in the longer run for the empirical side as well, to develop those models of mechanism. And that's what's most intellectually satisfying and gives you the highest chance of being able to, to get multiple runs out of any given trial.
I mean, that's why partnerships between government units and academia are so important. I mean, I was at a session earlier on how do you build a unit, and one of the points that kept coming up was the importance of having a strong academic group that you can lean on. As an academic, I'm interested in why stuff works. You're interested in what works. And I think the why it works can then let you scale up to other interventions in the future, because once you know why things work and why they don't, it's easier to generate other interventions in a focused manner. So I think it's a no-brainer that sort of partnership should help us with both those sides.
Tempted to answer, but you're going to try and get one more question, are we?
Answer.
Fine. Okay. Look, I mean, I serve as ministers as national advisor on what works, so maybe it's obvious what I'm going to say. But under the question "what works," and normally a series of other questions: what works, where, for who, when, But I still think, for the policy community and certainly for a lot of society, starting with what works is a pretty good place to start before you ask why. Otherwise, how the hell can you, if you don't even know what works, then, it's kind of, well, what are you asking? What does the why even mean often, right? Why don't we know what works might be an interesting question. So there's something, amongst, the refinements of the question, why we deliberately call the so-called what work centres in Britain and increasingly other countries, is because it's a pretty straightforward, disarmingly simple question, which most of the time we haven't been able to answer if we're honest about it. So that, I think, would be my answer.
And in every science, we know what works before why things work. It's true in physics, it's true in chemistry. You do your experiments first, you figure out what works, and then you build a theory. And that's just the way it is.
And one final question. Anyone?
Hi, I'm Kim Lowe from the Behavioural Insights Unit in New South Wales. I think there seems to be a bit of a distinction between applying behavioural sciences to ourselves and running RCTs. And running RCTs, I think we can all agree, are hard and haven't been getting easier. So do you think that that's a useful distinction in this debate, those sort of applying behavioural science and running RCTs? Or are we going down the wrong track at all, even sort of dividing the two?
Well, I guess I was the one to talk about individual stuff, I guess, more than anyone else, so I'll respond. As an academic, I think about everything from the lowest level of aggregation, so the micro level, individual people, to the slightly larger family or organization or community structure, to the whole society, the whole nation. And any of those levels of aggregation, I think, is eligible to benefit from an applied behavioral insight. So why not? And really, I think there's a lot of activity in behavioral economics specifically that looks at those different levels of aggregation and how they interact. We've got, as I said, more models of those things. How do groups influence individuals? How do individuals then, sort of adjust their behavior and then over time change the group, which is essentially the culture change process that you've spoken about before. How does that really happen? How do we query that so that we can learn from it and then intervene at any of those levels of aggregation? So for me, it's just a question of what level of aggregation are you talking about? The RCT thing, yeah, okay, they're hard, but again, if you had to make a determination, were they harder when economics first started to try to do them, or are they harder now when everybody knows the lexicon?
Excellent. And with that, we'll now move to counter rebuttals by David and Dilip for 3 minutes each, followed by closing statements by Julia and Gigi. So over to David for 3.
Okay, it's all very structured, isn't it? Yeah, look, so where are we at? By the way, thank you guys. It's been really fun, and it did seem a slightly crazy idea, but I think it has been quite interesting, and thanks for the questions too. So look, beyond the kind of semantics, I do think there is an important point where I'll return to at the very beginning, which is that we should try and make it as easy as we possibly can for our citizens, but many of us will have the day-to-day experience that it's pretty hard. I mean, actually, I do think on the last question, RCTs have got a bit easier because of data and other constraints. But it's really hard to break yourself out mentally from where you're at. Or we had the earlier question, which I didn't respond to, but around you talking about the press offices and so on. One of the things that certainly surprised me through the years is that many of the places we thought were going to be easy to do it, like press offices, well, they're already kind of doing that anyway. Like they're kind of doing messaging and so on. Wouldn't that be a good place? Or health departments, public health departments. They've been doing behavior change for years, smoking cessation, blah, blah, blah. Actually, they were not often the easy places to make progress. We have to make easier progress, in inverted commas, in departments that hadn't done it before and didn't already think they knew the answer. So we should at least steel ourselves to the fact that this stuff, the experience of it is, to me anyway, maybe you guys will be better at it, hasn't often been easy. But what I definitely think it is it's possible. It's possible to do this stuff. It is often cheaper. It is often more effective, more impactful, and we see some of these examples. And going to the question about SDGs, I genuinely think it's made it possible for us to take on some challenges which privately many policymakers have sort of given up on. We were never going to have. We were never going to crack. Like we were never going to get Anglo-Saxon to say, oh yeah, we can. Actually, we're never going to change the tide of obesity. Yeah, we can. We can take out sugar and we can do those things. So, look, in some, look, it's, my view is beyond the kind of wording of this, it's not that easy, but it's really worth doing. It's definitely worth thinking about what are the easier returns, what Dilip and others have hinted about. But for sure, it's worth doing, right? It's worthwhile. So otherwise, why would we be here?
All right. So I'll make a couple of points. I'd say things are getting easier for two reasons. One is that the population is better prepared, and second, that we're seeing large tectonic mindset shifts in the part of administration and our deputy ministers and so on and so forth. So let me just give you kind of a couple of points on each. The population at large is much more comfortable with behavioral science today than they were 10 years ago. So they've now read David's book, they've read Taylor's book, and you go in and talk about this stuff, and people say, oh yeah, that wasn't misbehaving, or that was a nudge, or that wasn't inside the inside the nudge unit. So I think people are a lot more tuned to the fact that there are discrepancies between what they want to do and what they end up doing, that they have self-control challenges, and so. And Cass talked about this yesterday. The acceptability of nudging is pretty good. I mean, I think 80% of people aren't worried about the fact that they might be nudged. So I think the population is better prepared. I think folks that have gone out and spread the gospel have done a great job in getting sort of the population ready for this sort of stuff. But I think the bigger stuff is the mindset shift in governments. I think that's huge. So one quick example, in Canada, and I think this is true of many governments, we had a task force on financial inclusion back in 2010. The task force concluded that Canadians weren't, financially savvy, surprise, that they needed financial literacy. And at that point in time, this was true in the US, it's true in Canada as well, financial literacy was meant to be financial education. So let's go teach people. And I think over the last 6 or 7 years, that debate has shifted from, it used to be that let's prepare people to deal with the financial system. Let's make them compliant with the financial system. Now it's moved to, let's make the financial system compliant with human behavior. And that is a major shift. And I think once you have that shift, the Minister of Finance actually says something like that, that completely changes the way in which units start thinking about helping people make better choices. So I'll stop there.
Let me just echo David. It's been a pleasure to think really deeply, not only about where we are, but where we have been, where we are going, and like what the road traveled to get here looked like, and what the road traveled to get there will look like. I mean, Not surprisingly, we have more or less talked about two things today. So we've talked about like, what does it mean for something to be easy? And then this fundamental question of like, what is a win? Like what ought we to aspire to? And there is this idea that it must get progressively, or this assumption that it must get progressively easier for entities. You know, if you're, for instance, starting a new BI team, as we just had this conversation, because you're standing on the shoulders of giants. But one observation that came out of that conversation is that nonetheless, teams more or less have grow at about the same pace, following about the same model, that you don't actually really see that acceleration effect. Like they have to embed and establish themselves in the government, that it is approximately as hard for someone to do that in a new geography now as it might have been 10 years ago, and then subsequently. And you might also imagine that you could also assume, and I think it's a fairly safe assumption, that there are more difficult contexts in which people will try to do that people will move into more challenging frontiers, whether they are in governments that are less well-resourced, or in situations where the policymakers are less literate, or where the operating environment or the political environment is just much, much more complicated. So I mean, I think there's a good case to be made that not only was it not ever easier, but it's still hard, but there's actually the potential for it to get even harder, even as the kind of way in which you start to make inroads is potentially even more worthwhile as you think about challenges like how you might wrestle with extreme poverty. What would it mean to actually close that last mile in terms of having access to clean water? How would you address challenges of corruption and extremism? And then, so this idea that literacy is improving across the government, I think that it's also possible, it's totally possible that that is true, and I think it's, that's probably broadly, it's broadly accurate, but it still kind of hasn't really helped us move to where I think we would hope the kind of end aspiration must be, which is behaviorally informed government, rather than behaviorally advised government, which is where you start. But how do you deeply entrench that conviction of your most convicted ministers and the capabilities of your most capable BI teams across the kind of length and breadth of your government? And then this question of, what is a win? Like, how do we actually make progress for citizens? Is a prima facie definition of what a win looks like. And I think, we're, all of us here would say we've made a great deal of progress. Hard won, easily won. Like, certainly a large amount of progress has been made. But in terms of actually closing that out, beginning to share those, building that really replicable body of knowledge, creating those meta-analyses that you can share around the world. That's the kind of critically important work that now must be done. That's what a win looks like now, and it is by no means straightforward.
And finally, Gigi for 5.
So in any production function, there's a cost involved, and the cost changes as you increase the number of units you're producing. And I would argue that what's happened over the last 20 years or so is that what initially seemed like easy wins, easy ways to get quick, better outcomes for people, felt eventually after we tried to replicate, like, oh no, that actually isn't what we want to do, and we got bogged down. It was like eating the forbidden fruit, where it was sort of knowledge, oh wow, the world is complex, oh wow. And so there was this sort of reckoning of, okay, well look, we thought it was easy, but now it's not, right? But what that means is that, what you're talking about there is not that it used to be easy and now it's not. It was never easy, we just thought it was, right? So it's a problem with the falling away of ignorance. You have this in any situation. And now that our ignorance has fallen away and we can see at least a larger fraction of the complexity that is truly there, then the expansion that we're looking at, and this is where the cost function analogy comes in, is either in the extensive or the extensive margin, right? So what you're speaking about with, the last mile as well, and, there's always going to be people who are really hard, sure. That's the intensive margin where you're saying, what if we get more and more and more and people touched by this? Inevitably, the easiest people to touch are the ones you touch first, right? But there is a huge canvas of extensive margin available, and Dilip referred to this originally, right? Going across different countries, going into different departments who are, prepped now because of the lexicon we have, because of all of this, the data mining stuff and the technology we've got, and just all of the networking across BI units around the world that is available to people who want to do this. That infrastructure is hugely supporting. So the extensive margin opportunities are there, and that's often where you get these, you can chip away at it easily in this situation and get those first 20% of people, which is a big and easy win. And I would say, even to think about the possibility of behavioral economics informed government is a luxury, right? Which we did not have 20 or 30 years ago. And all these What Works centers, so my colleague Paul Freiders works a lot with the What Works Center in LSE. And, the idea, he's being wheeled out at government policy departments, at the high levels of places in the UK and France and all over Europe, talking about how do we increase human well-being by, doing stuff differently with policy. Those conversations are, unthinkable 30 years ago. It was about GDP, right? We have changed the playing field, we've changed the goalposts, and I think increasingly we're bringing the policy people along with us to understand that what we are really on about in government departments is human welfare. We are not about just income or just GDP or just this or just that. There's so many invisible things, including our time costs and our loves and loyalties and the things that we want that we don't say, right? All of these things we're becoming more comfortable to say, okay, look, it's a kind of amalgamation of all this stuff. We go back to Amartya Sen and the Human Development Index kind of stuff. And just well-being, happiness, some sort of measure of that. We're starting to actually scientifically interrogate it in a way that's useful for policymakers. And that means that there's a huge potential to seriously impact well-being based on the shoulders of giants kind of argument that we've been working and chipping away at this for enough years now that we are starting to see a pivot of the system. And so I'm very optimistic that that will, in the next 20 years or so, deliver a lot more easy wins.
Excellent. Thank you, Gigi. Can we give another round of applause for all our speakers? So, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm an American, and I was brought up in a particular style of American debate called Lincoln-Douglas debate. And one of the cardinal sins in Lincoln-Douglas debate is to drop an argument. So I have to confess that I was surprised that the argument about the efficacy of the English cricket team, I have to admit, I'm surprised that was dropped. Never even addressed. Dilip would certainly think so. Now, I'm sitting here to reflect a little bit on areas of convergence and divergence that have emerged from this debate. But before I do, again, so as not to anchor you, could we take a final vote on the proposition? Our generous AV team, could we pull up the slides again? So please now go to tiny.cc/BX2018 post-debate and indicate if you agree or disagree with the proposition. Just to reiterate, if you indicate that you agree, you are endorsing the view that there are no more easy BI wins. If you indicate that you disagree, you hold that there are still easy BI wins to be had. And we'll tabulate.
Flash the word disagree subliminally.
While that is going on in the background, it bears remembering once more why we're here. From the sound of it, all of us on the stage hope we can continue gathering up low-hanging BI fruit in whatever form it may come, on an individual level basis, through RCTs, policy, lab experiments, in addition to trialing different and uncertain interventions. But all else equal, if we had the ear of a minister for only 5 minutes and could only sell one intervention idea, how would we adjudicate between these two agendas? Now, it seems clear that our speakers agree on a few things. One, they reject the premise of the, of the proposition, including those for the proposition, arguing in favor of the proposition. Two, and more seriously, that it was never truly easy. As has been stated many times, we do stand on the shoulders of giants, not least of which a few of those who are here on stage with us. And three, that we still have quite a bit of work to do in terms of trying to move the needle a little bit on culture change in systems, not just systems of government, but in the private sector and academia as well. But on the other hand, our speakers disagree about a few things as well. They disagree on what constitutes easy and easier, and it's not just a semantic difference. It's about, as Julia indicated, for example, what does an easy win look like for an extremely resource-constrained government? And how could we possibly hope to scale even a well empirically validated trial in some of those environments? And, as has already been discussed, they also disagree on what is a win. So we know, for example, that all of us would agree that null results, publishing null results, indicating just how important they are and the funding for them should be considered a win, even if they don't the intervention didn't necessarily work in the way that we thought it might. And again, a win might look different at a policy level than it does on an individual behavior change level, but nonetheless, both should be considered. In any case, coming from this debate, I have three hopes. I hope this argument prods us out of any sense of complacency we may have about the current sexiness of BI. We may not win a Nobel every decade, although we'll try. I hope it moves us to think creatively about other policy domains and issues where BI hasn't been applied. And I hope it challenges us to dream up other intervention ideas for which we don't have a clear steer on the risk-to-reward ratio. Anyway, now is the moment of truth. How do we feel about the proposition? So first, if this works correctly, let's check the gut check before the debate. 80% disagree, 20% agree. And now, after the debate. Have we moved the needle?
Is it statistically
70? There were 118 responses. The statistician in me thinks that that might actually be statistically significant. So a few minds were changed. Outstanding. Once again, would you please join me in thanking our speakers?